Look, I might actually just start with introductions because people will join. So first of all, welcome everybody online and special welcome to you, Patrick, good friend and fabulous researcher. We're very lucky to have you finding some time in your busy day to talk to us here in Australia. But I think it also exemplifies this is a global challenge that we can all learn and put our heads together. So I'm really thrilled to have you. The topic is how can we decarbonise society in ways that are place sensitive and fair? But before we kickstart, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners on the land of which the Curtin Institute for Energy Transition is sitting, the Whadjuk Noongar people, and pay our respects to their elders past, present, and also other traditional owners that might be dialing in from around Australia. Obviously, the exciting thing for energy transition that we're seeing emerge is the opportunity it presents for our First Nations people. And I think, you know, some of the stuff that you're going to refer to today, Patrick, on place-based applies very much in that. Now, everyone would have read your bio, but I'm just going to read a little quick excerpt just to make sure those that haven't. So Patrick Devine-Wright's research has been ranked in the world's top 1% of social science, according to citation of publications in multiple years. I won't leave them all out. He really is. His expertise spans human geography and environmental psychology, and he conducts theoretically driven research with real-world implications, often in interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary settings across local, national and international contexts. And he's engaged in efforts to ensure social science insights inform decision-making on a range of environmental challenges, notably climate change. And more excitingly, which we'll hear a little bit more, Patrick's the director of the £6.25 million of ESRC funded
UK
network. UK that champions the visibility, impact and use of social science to tackle environmental problems. I've been very fortunate to know Patrick for many years. He came and visited, I don't know how long ago it was now, as a visiting scholar at CSIRO. We've lost track. But as with everything with these researchers, I think we all become good friends as we try to tackle this challenge. So, Patrick, I'm going to hand over to you to, you know, share your insights, and then I will sort of zoom back at the end and we'll open. And just to sort of alert the audience, Patrick's has got a lot of detail in his slides. He may not go into all of that as he's talking through, but all of the slide pack and this recording will be made available so you can refer back to it. Obviously, everybody's automatically muted, but the chat will function, and we hope to encourage you to submit questions. Once Patrick's finished talking, it can be distracting before then, so I'll ask you to start submitting those after that. So thank you, Patrick. Over to you.
Cheers, Peter, and many thanks for the invitation. So let me just negotiate share screen and see if I can get the tech to work. Hold on a second. Okay, could you just reassure me that
I can see that? Looks good. Yeah, good. Perfect.
Good. Okay, well, let's get going then. I've got quite a bit to say, but I don't want to say too much in a sense because the Q&A is often the most fun part of these presentations. So yes, my name is Patrick Devine-Wright. As mentioned, I'm based at the University of Exeter, and I've been in geography and part of the Global Systems Institute there for the last 10 or 15 years. I won't actually say much on this at all. I've already had far too much introduction from Peter. Thank you very much. But I guess some key things to recognize about the kind of academic I am is that I do cross disciplinary boundaries a bit. I've always been interested in the siting of infrastructures, which have been and still are very controversial. I've worked across different technology sectors, and for me, what's interesting is some of the consistencies across those very different energy sources as much as the differences. And I like to get out there and do work in communities rather than in laboratories or etc. And finally, I've had a number of kind of roles which take academic knowledge into practice and into policy. And that's because I've always believed that, especially around the environment and climate emergency, it's actually important to try and get academic knowledge not just into peer-reviewed journals, but out of peer-reviewed journals so that it can be used and is more visible in the real world. And that's partly the reason for my involvement and leadership of the Access Programme, which I will begin with. But just to give you a quick sketch of the key topics I'll run through today, I'm going to start with the environment and climate emergency, which for me, provides a professional and personal setting for everything that's going to be said. I'll briefly introduce Access, which aims to contribute to the solution of environmental problems by drawing on social science knowledge and insights. So there's a fundamental presumption there that we need people-centered, human-centered approaches. Technologies are not enough in themselves. Then I'll go on to the substance of today's talk, which is about ideas of place, place attachment, sense of place, and just transitions. And I'll present a new framework, which has come out of a recent project to do with industrial decarbonisation and the use of technologies like carbon capture and hydrogen. And finally, I'll mention some work that's coming out very soon as part of the Access Work Programme, which is a task force on net zero and social transformations. As mentioned, the slides are available afterwards. Don't panic if you can't write all this down. And I've also included a few readings at the end if anybody is interested to follow things up. So without further ado, as I said, for me, this is the professional and personal context that we're in. I don't think I've ever thought that environmental issues were just a topic of research. I think it's very important for academic researchers in particular, but really everyone in this context, to be reflexive about how we do what we do, what our own environmental and carbon footprints are of the work that we do. So I'm very, very reluctant to fly anywhere for the purposes of my work unless it's absolutely necessary. And I think it's very important to try and bring that sensibility into our professional lives as much as anything else in order to ensure the continuing legitimacy and credibility of the expertise that we have. And so walking the talk, not just talking about it. Yeah. So that brings me to Access, I suppose, which is about advancing capacity for climate and environment social science. And it's something that is about halfway through. It's a 5-year investment, and it's led by the universities of Exeter and Surrey. And Access is a bit different. Let me try and just sketch out how Access is different. It's an investment by the UK Economic and Social Research Council, and it aims to provide leadership with a positive vision for what the social science contributions are to solving environmental problems. And some of this means constructively challenging conventional ways of thinking about what environmental problems are caused by and how they can be solved. And there's a real prevalence of kind of almost magical thinking that if we can get hydrogen right, or if we can get electric vehicles right, or we can get solar right, etc., offshore wind, you name it, technology after technology after technology, that these will somehow fix the problem for us. And the problem with that mentality is that it leads to social science insights being brought in at what we call the end of the pipe. You know, after you've worked out what the solution is, you know, bringing in engineering expertise, you then think about, well, how do we make people accept it? Or how do we communicate to people the benefits about it? And from an Access point of view, there is so much more benefit to be drawn from social science expertise by bringing people, those experts, and bringing that insight in earlier in the process to help set the question at the beginning. I also have this kind of idea in my head of an iceberg of knowledge that's not really being tapped into and utilized sufficiently. So it's about making better use of the knowledge we already have out there. For example, as I'll show, there's been 50 years of social science research on sense of place now since the early 70s. But I don't think we're actually that good at getting that knowledge out there in a way that's usable and accessible and visible. And Access is definitely about that. And the other important thing about Access is that we're not just a bunch of academics in an ivory tower who are trying to kind of tell people how amazing our insights are. Inside our leadership team, we actually have social science experts who work in government agencies, and they help to ground us and to connect us and to make us better understand our own position as a kind of a boundary spanning object. And if you see the image here, you can see that Access is pretty unusual. We try and connect academia with policy. We also try and connect academia with funders. We're involved in scoping new research questions. So we sit across different boundaries. We're a kind of a networking agent as much as a project. And that really informs how we go about our work as well. Informed by that set of insights about the climate emergency and the environmental emergencies we're in, we have an integrated guiding principles approach, which means that we reflexively, carefully think about how we co-produce our knowledge, how we look after our own sustainability implications, and always consider issues of equality, diversity, and inclusion. And I can give examples of that when we get to the discussion. But overall, it's about how do we achieve a step change in the visibility, use, and ultimately the impact of the social sciences in solving environmental problems. And that comes from conceptualizing those environmental problems as human problems at the end of the day, problems involving society, politics, communities, consumers, citizens, etc. All of those insights and ways of thinking need to be brought to bear. And just to give you an example of what some of the things that Access gets up to in a typical year might look like, well, we have quarterly meetings with a whole set of government agencies and departments to co-produce our work programme and share latest research findings. Our kind of showpiece event, which is coming up in June, is an annual assembly where we facilitate network building and information sharing across disciplinary boundaries and across sectoral boundaries, because no discipline or sector are going to solve these challenging problems on their own. But how do we make those connections and networks in a trusted way? That's what we're trying to do. We also are building a cohort, training and empowering a cohort of social scientists who are based across different sectors. Some of them are in government, some of them are in third sector or private sector organizations, some of them are early career researchers in academic universities. And we bring this cohort of early leaders together and try and empower them every year through a retreat. £1 million of our budget is a flexible fund. So actually we're kind of a research funding engine ourselves. And we try and bring our approach to our guiding principles into how we distribute those resources to try and innovate, not new knowledge about the social science, but in a way about the translation and communication of that social science to audiences that need it. And finally, we try and do some agile work in response to stakeholder needs. And I'll mention the task force on net zero at the very end. So that was a very quick whistle stop through Access, and I'm going to shift gear now to one of the core topics of my talk, which is about place. So why should we be talking and thinking about place today? Well, let's just start with the idea that place is not as simple as it sounds. It's, in fact, you could say it's one of the trickiest words in the English language because it's got so many different layers of meaning to it. On the one hand, it's the kind of topic that you can talk about with your neighbor or your pal or somebody in work. You know, everybody understands that London is a place, Brisbane is a place, Australia is a place. So place covers different scales, but everybody kind of understands that it's a geographical location in the world. And yet it actually covers so much more than that. It covers the kind of meanings associated with that place, the feelings we have about it, what goes on in it, who's included or who's excluded from those kinds of places. And social scientists and people interested in spatial academic disciplines like geography for many decades have been interested in interrogating this term and putting it to use. And you can see some of the related ideas that connect to place quite nicely. Ideas about the local, what's near and proximate to us, which is assumed to be important to us. Ideas about home as a kind of a safe haven, a place of belonging, a place of connection to people, a sense of community, and a place of belonging, as I mentioned. So place is tricky, not just because of its own ambiguities, but because of the way it does and does not connect into these other slippery social science ideas. And these all are at the boundaries of academic disciplines as well. So if you want to be an expert in place, it's pretty tough because you need to read landscape architecture, you need to read philosophy and poetry, you need to read human geography, environmental psychology, environmental sociology, etc. And that makes it actually a real challenge to get your head around. But there's also a lot to be gained, I would say, by looking at all of those different perspectives and learning from them. So if we have to define place, we could say that it's a space that holds meaning. And what begins as something that's undifferentiated becomes a place as we get to know it better, we name it, we relate to it, we endow it with some kind of value. So it's meaningful to us in some important way. And that's the kind of staple of human geography thinking that's existed since the 70s. What's grown over time is appreciation of the politics of place, the fact that place doesn't stay static. It's always struggled over. It's also relational. You can't see it as a kind of a bounded thing with a wall around it. It relates different places in the world, and it can be potentially exclusionary. I think it's very important to start by not romanticizing place or the local as being some kind of perfect place or a place where everybody gets on. We know that that's not the case either. And so geographers have been particularly sensitized to ways that we can exclusionary, we can kind of exclude people or ideas and try and stop change to places. And that's part of the story of place too. So it's not at all straightforward. Now, you can also identify subdimensions of place. We've mentioned its kind of geophysical characteristics as a place in the world with grid coordinates. You can define it as a locale where different people or groups interact, and there are norms about how those interactions should take place, what's appropriate behavior, what are people likely to be doing in that place. And those can be infringed. We can get transgressions of those locales, which human geographers have been interested in for a long time now. And thirdly, this kind of more subjective, emotional dimension that people have with place, which many different fields of expertise have been interested in, and often which are harder to capture. And that's one of the challenges of them that needs to be thought about very carefully. And there's a little quote from James Joyce from the city where I grew up. Dublin will be written on my heart. So it's not just a physical place in the world. Sometimes almost inevitably, if we live in a place for a very long period of time, we grow these emotional connections to places or place attachments. And sometimes we only really realize the depth of those connections when those places are confronted with change. And that's important when we start to think about why we could think about infrastructure siting, like high voltage power lines or wind farms, in terms of place and change to place. So let's just interrogate sense of place with a little bit more depth as well, because there's a whole host of terms brought about by different academic disciplines which try and understand the different forms of sense of place that exist. And these are just some that I wish to highlight as being particularly relevant today. I've mentioned place attachments. Place identity refers to the identities that are interlinked or embedded within a place. These can be quite personal, but they're also much more likely to be social as well, referring to groups or communities, people like us. And that links to sense of community, a sense of belonging, a sense of connectedness, of shared interests, shared goals, shared characteristics of the people who live in a particular place over time. The lived experience of what it's like to be there for good or for ill, recognizing that places are never perfect. And also local knowledge, which is really important. It's a kind of expertise or a knowing that comes from living in a place over time. And the pictures on the right are interesting here. We held, as I'll tell you in a moment, we held focus groups recently in industrial heartlands, they're described, around the UK, and asked people to bring things which were important to them to describe what the place, the local place that they live in, means to them. And people brought various objects. In the bottom of the picture, it's a postcard of what the place used to be like in the 70s. And this isn't about nostalgia, but it's about reflecting on the changes that have taken place in industrial places over time, not always for the better. And also the kind of flotsam and jetsam of changes to place, the connections to the natural side of places that people treasure, the stones, the shells, the seaweed, etc., that allow people to connect with nature in a particular local environment. So the place sensitivity idea comes from a way of seeing the world. And this is where we really get into the depth of what thinking through place might actually mean. So to think of an area of the world as a rich and complicated interplay of people and environment, it means we don't just think about it in terms of facts and figures, the kind of dry, abstract, unemotional way of connecting to a location in the world. We see worlds of meaning and experience. And for a long time, I've been thinking through and observing how different approaches to infrastructure deployment are viewed by the stakeholders and the host communities and the government agencies, and recognizing that Unfortunately, too often we think in the abstract, using purely facts and figures in terms of how we think about infrastructure deployment, how we think about achieving policy goals like renewable energy targets or net zero, etc. And there isn't enough place-sensitive thinking, which sees and recognizes local experience, lived experience, local knowledge, place attachments, place identities. We need more of that, I think, and that's partly what this talk is about. It's not that we don't need technology or we don't need facts and figures. It's just that they're not going to be enough for us to generate a fair and human-centered process of transformation that we need to do things quickly and effectively. So there's an issue about change. How do places change? Who has power over those? And this relates place very clearly with ideas of justice. Environmental justice in terms of the distribution of outcomes, of costs and benefits, risks and impacts, the procedures of decision-making, and the recognition of different voices or the recognition of different ideas. For example, the local knowledge that I just mentioned. What we can say, I think, is that large-scale energy infrastructures bring extensive changes to local places. Anybody who's witnessed attempts to create a 60-kilometer high-voltage power line, a 400 kV line, knows that the scale of that kind of infrastructure deployment, whether it's overground or underground, is going to bring extensive changes to the character of places and landscapes. That's for sure. And if that change is interpreted as being negative or disruptive, it can threaten these attachments. That, in turn, is an environmental injustice issue that we need to be sensitive to. There is very productive discussions taking place in the UK and worldwide around the idea of a just transition, a just energy transition. And what I would say is that, yes, we need to think about training and diversification and skills and workers. That's very important. But we also need to think about host communities in the round. And that's where I'm going to be talking about in terms of the place-based just transitions framework that we've been looking at in a recent project. So all of these have implications for supposed ideas about community objections, which has been known for a very long time under the acronym of NIMBYism. So what we know from the social science literature is that threats to sense of place can mobilize groups of people to take collective action to try and prevent unwanted change. And that can be infrastructure deployment, but it can be other things too. But we also know that it is both inaccurate and pejorative. It is simply kind of stereotyping objectors to simply describe place protective actions as NIMBYism, or to use other kinds of shorthand acronyms like BANANA, build absolutely nothing anywhere near anybody. Yeah, they're quick off the shelf terms, but there should be more to it than that, I think. We can come back to that. So conflicts over infrastructure siting are difficult to solve because they involve different and often hidden or overlooked forms of value and rationality between different ways of thinking about a place as facts and figures, or a place as meaning and experience. And often stakeholders don't even understand that that's what's going on, and actors are speaking kind of in parallel and not meeting in the middle because they're using different languages. They're speaking from different perspectives. We need to try and sort that out. But I would say more positively that place-sensitive thinking offers creative new approaches to infrastructure deployment based on those ideas of meaning and experience I've been mentioning. Ideas about place technology fit, or a place-based technology like wind energy, and we can discuss that in more detail. So I'm going to talk briefly now about the outcomes of a project I've been involved in over the last 3 years about industrial decarbonisation in the UK. And if you look at the map in the middle, you can see that there are places in the UK that are hotspots with thousands of tons of CO2 being emitted from industrial facilities in these places. These places have host communities that have lived with these industrial facilities over many decades. Of course, they benefit through local employment, local economic advantages, but they also have to live with the everyday experience of potential hazards, the flaring of gas, potential explosions and risks, etc., that go with that, the air pollution that leads to your washing being dirty or your car being soiled by things coming out of dirty chimneys. So these are places that the UK has to deal with in order to decarbonise and reach net zero. And IDRIC was a large UKRI investment that was able to integrate engineering and social science together. And this particular project involved 4 different universities, 4 different social science teams, and 9 different researchers coming together to try and stitch the findings in a way that we thought might be accessible to stakeholders and policy in particular. So let's start with 3 places. One of them is in Scotland, and it's called Grangemouth, not far from Edinburgh. One of them is in England, near the border of Wales, and it's called Ellesmere Port. And thirdly, the final place is called Milford Haven in southwest Wales. As you can see, all of them are on the water. They're all ports, and that's because they've been a site of large-scale industry for many, many years. It's stitched into the history and the culture of these places. You can go back to a time when the Vikings sailed in the rivers. There's been whaling industries that have come and gone. So not only do they know industry, but they know deindustrialization and reindustrialization as the cycles of boom and bust or deployment over time come and go. And they're now experiencing all the hoo-ha about net zero. Amazing, huge investments facilitated by public and private sector into novel technologies like carbon capture and large-scale hydrogen production facilities. So what we did was to go to these places, and we had meetings with stakeholders, we had meetings with local residents to find out more about how this was going down in local areas. And when we spoke to stakeholders about their visions for the future of these places, the UK has a 2050 net zero target. What does that mean for Ellesmere Port, for Milford Haven, and for Grangemouth? And what we found when you ask stakeholders about the future of these places is that they were poorly able to articulate the place-based dimensions of that. They simply kept talking about technologies being deployed to describe the changes. And if you look at the benefits on the right, this is from one of the industrial cluster websites, we're in a land of facts and figures here. It'll be billions of that, thousands of these, 80% of this, that, and the other. We are predominantly in the world of facts and figures here. Correspondingly, very little emphasis on the people side of technology deployment, where the technology will be deployed, what it's like to be a neighbour or a host community of a new hydrogen plant. It's not that place was not talked about at all. It was, but only some of the time and only in very narrow ways. It was used as a kind of a marketing tool to brand places as being net zero friendly, attracting inward investment. The other dimensions of place that I've been talking about in terms of local knowledge, lived experience, place attachments, place identities, not really touched upon by almost all of the stakeholders we spoke to. Some people were aware of that. Some people knew that we needed to take host communities with us on this net zero journey, but by and large, not as much as we heard. And because of that, the picture that was painted of community engagement in industrial decarbonisation was extremely limited. We would say it's extremely deficient, it's reactive, it's fragmented, it's highly instrumental around fast technology deployment, but often that's just limited to PR. And that doesn't go down well with the residents living in these host communities. So what we did was we went to these places, like Milford Haven. The top is a picture of the museum. I could speak for ages about what it's like. We were there on a very sunny day. There were 3 or 4 old fellas sitting outside getting the sun. They're volunteers in this museum, and if you go in there, you can find out about the Vikings, you can find out about the whaling industry, you can find out about the arrival of oil and gas refinery industries and connections to to Middle Eastern countries from the 1950s. So the process of research here is important in terms of how we do social science. It's about connecting with people in place, about avoiding extractive research that simply takes data for our journal papers, but actually tries to meaningfully connect with residents on the ground and use facilitated methods that are useful to draw out their experiences, like asking them to bring objects to describe the meaning that a place might have for them. But most importantly, we don't just speak to local residents, we try and bring inclusive spaces together to enable conversations that simply aren't happening enough between government representatives on the one hand, industry representatives, and host community representatives and residents on the other. These kinds of interactions are not happening enough, and they're not happening enough because host communities often stay away from official consultations because they've seen it all before. They're very well versed in box-ticking, tokenistic consultation, and for that purpose, why would they bother going to engagement events? They simply don't trust the motives of the companies behind it, or the local authorities often, or government representatives, because they've been through that hoop many, many times for different kinds of initiatives. And some of the time they were suspicious about our own research. What was the point engaging with us if we weren't going to have an impact on them? Or sometimes people did come and it provided a space for these kind of conversations to happen. So we were almost like an intermediary enabling consultation to take place where normal statutory processes differed or were difficult to achieve. Anyway, I better move on, looking at the time. So the key thing to say is that we didn't find evidence of NIMBYism in these communities. We didn't find evidence of the banana syndrome. These host communities are not against industry. They're proud of their heritage and their past. But that doesn't mean they're just going to take any promise of a net zero future as if, oh yeah, fine, whatever. You know, they are appropriately critical. They want to have adult conversations. They want to feel proud of the places that they live in. But there are so many reasons why they find that challenging. And that's important for policy and for industry to understand. If you look at a Milford Haven resident saying, we're hearing all of this about millions and billions of investment by private sector corporations, but we have food banks, we've got child poverty in this community. How do we ensure that those people are positively affected, not just stakeholders or shareholders in industry who are living elsewhere? And so people also have a sense that things are very different from the 1970s and 1980s. At that stage, it looked like anchor employers, large employers in big industrial locations were actually embedded within the community, sponsors of local children's football teams or sports clubs, whatever it might be. That has changed over time. There's been a sense of withdrawal, a sense that these industries are taking from the area and not giving anything back. So that reciprocity is overlaid onto and builds on a lack of trust, which needs to be addressed. So what we've tried to do is basically put together a place-based just transition framework, which we think can provide actionable knowledge to stakeholders and promote a kind of place-sensitive way of thinking about net zero. So it's not just about technologies, it's about a socio-technical process of change. This recognizes technology deployment is fundamental to net zero, but it's also a kind of a place-making process. When technologies are deployed in the world somewhere, you are remaking places that already exist. You've got to engage and relate to host communities and recognize that you will inevitably shape sense of place in doing so. Highlighting that support by communities, by the public, by workers for these new and largely unfamiliar and unproven technologies makes concerns about past environmental injustices come to the fore. People want to know if this is going to be the same old story or it's going to be something new, something fresh, something more positive that is place enhancing. So we're calling for a place sensitive mindset that recognizes these different justice dimensions of not just community benefit provision, which is obviously important for distributional justice, but there are other important dimensions of change to do with recognizing lived experience and meaning, recognizing the need for people to participate in shaping their own collective place futures as well through procedures and mechanisms of participation. So this is what this framework looks like. I'm only going to spend a couple of seconds or moments to describe it, but essentially it's a framework designed to provide some key knowledge to stakeholders about how to achieve net zero futures in a place-sensitive and fair way. Firstly, this is a continuing spinning dial. It's changing and evolving over time. It's 2024 now. We've got over 2 decades to 2050. Everything is going to shift and to flux over time. So this needs to be seen not in a static way. We need to incorporate those 3 dimensions of justice in terms of recognition justice, recognizing place sensitivity, recognizing the need for procedural justice through genuine rather than tokenistic community engagement, and viewing the importance of localized benefits and fairness. And if you look at the 5 place dimensions around these in the middle hoop, you can see that net zero is an opportunity to encourage pride in industrial places, to recognize the changes that have taken place there over time, to ground the benefits of technology deployment in a fair way, to build a sense of reciprocity where there is a sense of a challenge there at the moment in changes since the 70s, in engaging in future visioning of these places in 2050. So net zero isn't just an abstraction in 2050, but it is embedded and in a local context, and it has some meaning there in terms of what kind of place are we trying to build in terms of tackling child poverty or food poverty, etc., or fuel poverty, and making sure that everyone benefits from that. We create a kind of a clean, thriving, green place with a sense of cohesion. And then finally, recognizing and unlocking that local knowledge that I mentioned, the expertise that is in these communities, but is often looked down on by other forms of expertise drawn on in technology deployment processes. Around the framework, we have these issues which take locality and connect it to broader political structures, and they need to better join up and avoid top-down, very top-down political rollout of net zero. So connecting up local government, regional government into these regional clusters of, and national government into these regional clusters of industries. Recognizing that this is not going to be easy, that there will be tensions between different stakeholders, there will be tensions between different agendas and values, and that needs to be made explicit through genuine participatory mechanisms. And finally, starting from the viewpoint that usually there are deficits of trust. And so the credibility of claims about the benefits of new technologies need to be tackled from the start. And if it's just a sense that communities are being given PR about only the positive side of change, they're likely to switch off and engagement will not prove to be successful. So we've come up with a number of recommendations. You can see them there about rebuilding trust and about taking a place-sensitive perspective, recognizing meaning and experience. Right, I'm going to stop now just to say that I have recently produced with a colleague, Adam Peacock, a systematic review of research using place ideas to understand energy infrastructures, and it's just come out in this particular journal. If anyone is interested to follow that up, please do. And finally, just to mention this task force and the group of findings that are coming out of it in the next month or two. Take a look at the Access website, but it starts with the idea that net zero isn't just about technology transformation, it's also about social transformations as well. And we need to draw on all of the social sciences in an in-depth way, in a genuine and concerted way, in order to understand and to plan for the changes and the contestations that are likely to come. So, final word here, just coming back to a paper I wrote a couple of years ago. We are only likely to achieve a fair net zero policy and industry strategies by going beyond ephemeral and superficial appropriations of place, grounding industrial decarbonisation in social science theory and research, not just easy acronyms, adding novel insights and providing more comprehensive and just foundations for the changes so urgently required. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Patrick. Fantastic, as I expected, and triggered lots of thoughts. I, was thinking back to when you were here, and at that stage there was a lot of onshore wind happening, and I know, we talked a lot around the sort of sense of place and how we could influence. And as you were talking then too, I thought of what's gone on in Latrobe Valley, which was the brown coal centre of Victoria. And, they've had exactly that thing. I mean, I've been involved in different sort of focus groups down there over years. And I remember one lady who actually came back in 10 years later and she's going, the big thing is there's all this great innovation, but no one ever tells us what happens after it. So I was thinking about that sort of this idea of place sensitive thinking. And how do we avoid the angst that comes with new project announcements? I'm just thinking offshore wind at the moment is very topical. It's just at such an early stage, exploratory, but already there are communities protesting, and I just see all of this terrible negative energy for them. How can we encourage that place sensitive thinking to be coming from our policymakers at the start, do you think?
Well, I think the first thing is that we've got to recognize that we have a problem on our hands. And in some ways, the consistent problem that you have in Australia, and we have in the UK and Ireland and other places as well, is that when we have that angst, what tends to happen, the knee-jerk reaction is, okay, what do those people not get? Because we've got the policy in place, we need to tackle climate change. So why are they making it so difficult for us? And so, unfortunately, there's a widespread tendency to assume that you've got a very complicated technology deployment sector development process. But if there's any problem, we tend to point the finger at local objectors or community members or action groups instead of looking at conflicts more systemically. And I would say that, as you know, we've discussed NIMBYism many times. It's no accident, I think, that we don't really have corresponding languages for why developers get it wrong or why engagement doesn't happen, or if we adopted more of a place-sensitive mindset, if we took participation more seriously, then these kinds of conversations would be happening much earlier. And I fundamentally believe that these issues would come up earlier and they'd be more easily solved because we're not continually picking up the pieces of a mess that's already been created through ways of technology deployment where people have been really ignored, and they're taking that expectation and mistrust into these contexts of a new technology. Really basic things. 15 years ago, people were talking about offshore wind, the fallacy of assuming that because it's way out there in the sea, communities won't care, or acceptance isn't an issue. There's this sense that the further away it is, the less challenge it is. But all of these infrastructures need connecting into the grid. They need cables on shore, etc. It's really frustrating to see these challenges arising again and again. And it's because the social is not integrated into the technical, either in policy or in industry, well enough.
Yeah, I see it a lot here, that governments run scared to have the conversations early almost, because, if we get some negativity, that's bad. But actually starting the conversation needs to be the foundation of, trying to understand and unpick what people are feeling in that way. So,
I mean,
go.
Just say the people in our host communities, I've just been to these industrial places, they are desperate for what they call adult conversations. They are entirely switched off by people coming in saying, loads of money, loads of jobs, amazing economic benefits. And no one says anything about any potential risks or potential downsides, and they immediately switch off. So treat these people like adults. They're going to be in these. We have to develop relationships with communities because the infrastructure will be there for decades, rather than just getting in and out quick as late as possible, minimizing the risk. That doesn't work. There are plenty of examples of how that's gone completely, it hasn't worked. It's actually led to more challenges down the road.
I'm just going to touch on something briefly, but ask people have started putting questions, so I want to get to those very quickly. But you referred to Banana, the build absolute nothing. And that's been cited by our former chief scientist, really trying to bring a focus on people as being part, as where universities can play. So just love to get your more deeper thoughts on that. And then I'm going to go to some of the questions and encourage people to add more questions. Thanks, Patrick.
Yeah, well, I think if people remember anything from this talk, it's drop the dodgy acronyms and instead engage with the peer-reviewed social science evidence. Things like NIMBY and Banana, they're handy, they're off the shelf, they're easy to use, but they don't really capture the complexity of what's going on in these different situations, these different geographical locations, these different host communities. But we have decades now of social science evidence about what are the challenges of engagement, participation, of community benefit provision, of recognizing different dimensions of place. But unfortunately, many people who are experts in technology or many people who are in government don't have that expertise. And I'm not saying it's their fault either. Social scientists need to be much better at communicating what we already know, but we don't do that. We're very good at writing peer-reviewed journal papers, but who reads social science journal papers except ourselves? So we need to get beyond speaking to ourselves and getting this knowledge out there and getting better at communicating it as well. If we have a truly socio-technical approach to net zero and these technologies, we have some chance. But if we keep a kind of a superficial idea of the socio bit, I'm not too hopeful.
Yeah, great. So I'm going to go to some of the questions. This one's from Peter Hansford, which sort of talks about that we're increasingly living in both the real world and the virtual world, and social media, as we know too well, warps the sense of community and belonging, which may redefine place. How does this impact on the deployment of infrastructure when the tech genie is out of the bottle?
Yeah, well, I think it's a good point. What we mean by engagement is completely transformed, I suppose. In a sense, I would say that one of the implications, there are many implications of social media and these different platforms. They enable new forms of consultation and engagement. So they can have quite positive opportunities, the use of virtual reality, etc., different ways of what would have been shown in photo montages before. If you want to try and get across what this technology will look like in a particular coastal or marine setting, there are new ways of doing that, which is a plus. But it also means that it's almost impossible now to kind of keep a technology project under wraps, or to keep things quiet, or to keep things late as possible before you start engaging. Once people start to see what's going on, they're going to be asking questions. It's easier to share information than ever before. So for me, it almost kind of accelerates the value of engaging appropriately and early enough with credible information about the plans that are going to be put in place for technology deployment. And yes, that involves courage. It involves leadership. It involves having difficult conversations. And of course, I'm not saying that host communities cannot be selfish, that there aren't people out there who misuse platforms or spread misinformation. Of course, that happens as well. But disengaging from that or trying to keep it as late as possible is not going to make that go away. So I would say, be clear about the value of engagement and make sure that the story you're trying to tell is one that connects into people's everyday lived experience. It isn't just about facts and figures or national policy targets, but try and ground the narrative of technology deployment in community and place so that it can connect with people's concerns in host communities.
Perfect. I'm going to go to Karia Mahajas. She put up a long question, but I'm just going to cut to the chase of, she's asking, would there be any places on Earth without humans? Can any other sentient beings feel places? Can one say that thinking about the biosphere in terms of places risks appropriation of what may be beyond human articulations, thus giving priorities to human experiences over other forms beyond humans?
Oh, that's an interesting question.
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, I'm certainly not trying to privilege human experience over any other kind of, life form, etc. That's not what it's about. And I think, to tackle the environment, to recognize the environment biodiversity problem at the same time as the climate emergency, we can't get fixated solely on carbon emissions, etc., or new technology deployment. I mean, I think if you go into the writings on place, you'll find that it can enable a very deep sensitivity to all of the things that we share localities with. that we reside. It emphasizes the connections between different parts of the environment as much as between different people or technologies as well. So I think it has that potential. But I think it's a good point that we must be careful not to be too anthropogenic around these things, and also be aware of other ways of being in a place and other ways of knowing a place, which isn't just our own limited understandings. Yeah, I think it's a good point.
Also interesting, though, we're seeing this trade-off between biodiversity play out with environmental rulings. And yet, if you think about the overarching impacts of climate, as you started out, if we don't address these issues, then, you wonder what will be the end game as well. So I think there is sort of, it's interesting.
Yeah, and many of the places that I was going to there, those industrial places, they are full of natural environments, and those coastal areas connecting with that ecology is one of the reasons why people fear the kind of changes that are now being proposed under net zero technology deployment. So there's certainly appreciation and recognition of those connections.
Thank you. So this is a question from Douglas Booker, and he says, in your work, have you encountered place-based claims of environmental justice, in brackets, injustice, that have clashed with claims of environmental justice or injustice in other places? If so, how does one navigate this?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really excellent question. And it comes back to the point I was trying to make in the beginning, that place isn't a panacea. We also have to be careful about romanticizing the local. So absolutely. I mean, I think this is where governance really comes in. We can't think about net zero simply as a collection of different local places that need solutions. It has to be integrated and joined up together. So I think one of the challenges for national government is to be able to at once put together a kind of large-scale technology trajectories and scenarios and targets and policies for those, and at the same time connect them into a kind of an ecosystem of places at the local level which enable host community participation, but in a way that has connecting back up to the national level again. So that's a very challenging process to take. It's a kind of a mixture of bottom up and top down. It's recognizing that neither one nor the other is going to be sufficient. We have to have better governance, I think, and conversations across those scales of deployment and policy delivery, or it's not going to happen. And that's really difficult. I'm not sure anywhere's quite managed to capture that well enough yet, but that's the challenge that we have to do at the moment.
I think last time I saw you, we were looking at the climate change at that local, very much local level, climate change, the Climate Change Authority work. So yeah, again, How do you influence? So Anna Kane, big fan of yours apparently. So she's interested in whether or how you draw on ideas of place from non-Northern scholarship or cultures. So she talks about here in Australia, the transition is very different understandings of place and its meaning. So settler colonial ideas of what place is, and then First Nations ideas. So thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I do remember engaging with that during the different trips I made to Australia a decade ago. Yeah, it's interesting. In some ways, I'm very attuned to those because I'm not English, I'm Irish. And in Ireland, we have a kind of a native culture which has never gone away and which is really quite pagan in many ways in terms of connecting with ideas of an other world, of portals between this world and the next, and viewing opportunities to connect with different ways of meaning. So I'm very sensitive to that personally. But you're right, we have a deep scholarship problem in a sense that I've just produced that systematic review. There's a huge challenge in the sense that 80 to 90% of the scholarship in this area in social science is coming from a small number of wealthy industrial countries in a sense. It's not representative of different kinds of experiences and forms of expertise around the world, and that needs to change. So that's why one of the things that we're doing in Access is to try and open up social science and try and enable better social science, certainly in a UK context, and it would be good to think about it more broadly than that. So, yeah, I mean, we are inevitably, I mean, to me, that's one of the things that social science brings. It means that kind of reflexive understanding of the limitations of your own perspectives and your own positionality in the world, which often I think isn't there sufficiently enough. So, Yes, if you go into the place literature, you'll find that, and then it's incumbent on us to make sure that we bear that in mind if we're in situations where we're trying to relay that knowledge into policy or stakeholder decisions.
And I think here we're seeing that through recognition of government funding First Nations Clean Energy Network, trying to tap into that knowledge. And there's a whole lot of work, but it's still a long way. And I think we see it across the world, the learnings that we can share. Yes, but challenging.
It's just so important. And it comes back to, so, I mean, place sensitivity, you can see it as trying to capture some of that Australia is grappling with, Canada's grappling with it in terms of Indigenous peoples over there and their own attempts to decarbonise society. I mean, all of this highlights the fact that there are different kinds of knowledges out there that we need to draw on in order to accelerate net zero transitions. Access is kind of campaigning for social science. The engineers and the economists are already there in a sense in terms of the seat at the policy table saying, look, we need to get the technologies right and the costs right. But we need to, and I think the IPCC is increasingly recognizing these different forms of knowledges, but we still have a long way to go in terms of how we integrate them together in a way that actually appreciates and recognizes them all rather than just some kinds of scientific expertise. I think that's still a huge challenge.
And it's interesting, as you say, because this has been going on for many, many years in different energy tech, and yet we still, I don't know, it's interesting that we're still struggling to get that response, I suppose.
Well, there's just too many vested interests in this system. People don't want to give away privilege and status. But unfortunately, we just have to do that. If we're going to, I mean, I want to think about the world that my children and their grandchildren are going to be living in 50 years' time. And we just have to be a bit more magnanimous and look to the future and have further thinking about, 50, 100 years' time. And then these kind of concerns become much less important. But unfortunately, even in academia too, we're very driven by money and grants and anyway, the usual, but it's not going to get us there.
So we're very close to time and there's a few, but I'm just going to ask Bishal. So Bishal Baharaj asked, are context-based approaches and place-based approaches linked, and how place-based approaches help address the heterogeneous impact of net zero pathways in hierarchical societies?
They should do, because basically a context-driven approach, which sounds a bit like a lot of geography scholarship I know, it takes the assumption that a one-size-fits-all solution won't work, that interventions need to be locally appropriate. And that demands what I cited Drenthen's work, an ethic of the particular. If we assume that Adelaide is the same as Aberystwyth and Abergavenny, and London's the same as Lithuania, we're not going to get very far, but we're producing technologies which are designed to fit anywhere. And that's a central problem. So we need to bring those two different mindsets together. And that's what I've been saying would kind of revive a really deep and rich view of a socio-technical process of change, embedding that geographical understanding, the different social science disciplines and ways of knowing, forms of expertise, with the technology know-how that we also know we need to have as well moving forward. So it's about putting that blend of ideas together early enough in the process to make the change happen in a way that's fair as well.
We're going to run out of time, but from Alex Wells, are there ways you've seen work that we as social scientists can highlight the need for having these open, adult and sometimes challenging conversations early on that build trust and thus help achieve the outcomes the stakeholders and policymakers are aiming for?
Well, the good thing is that social scientists now, and even practitioners in planning, we have so many tools and mechanisms and techniques up our sleeves now. There's been decades of work done in planning and participation in technology assessment about how you do engagement, facilitation, visioning, scenario building, and we're really good at that. More recently, I'll just very briefly talk about the University of Exeter's role in supporting the Devon Citizens Climate Assembly, which was a deliberative, democratic innovation. The council had never tried it before. They didn't know how to do it, so they came to us for expertise. We tried to provide that expertise in a timely way. We succeeded in doing something that had never been done before, which is to bring 80 representative citizens into policymaking on climate. We know how to do this. We just need to do it a bit more than we're doing, and we can reinvigorate policymaking and make it more trusted then, because people are actually having a say in it, not just elected politicians. And that's part of the process of transformation that I think we need to undertake.
I've been pushing these deliberative processes quite a lot here in Australia, and it's really interesting to see the nervousness of policymakers to take them on, because how do you control the output? And I said, well, it's all about just helping to frame the question, let people co-design. Yeah, absolutely. Patrick, there's other questions that have come through, but look, we're out of time, and there's lots of fan mail on there as well. So I think there's many people here that have really, followed the work that you've done, and fair play to you also with the work with access. And I think, there's a question here trying to understand more, but I would, as you say, go on the website and delve down into some of that. Thank you so much for taking time out of your very, very busy schedule. It's always so nice to hear you talk and share your experience, and I'm very privileged that you could spend an hour out of your busy time. So thank you.
Sure. You're very welcome, and thanks.
And we'll keep in
Great.
touch.
Cheers.
Absolutely.
Appreciate it.
Okay. Thanks very much.
Hope
and
to
thanks
speak again
everyone
soon.
for joining.
Yeah.
Okay. Bye.
All the best. Thanks for all the questions. Bye-bye now.